Before we talk about pyramids, before gold masks, before gods carved in stone, I want you to imagine something uncomfortable. Imagine being born and never being allowed to be human. Ancient Egypt is often remembered as majestic, mysterious, beautiful, but behind the monuments, behind the myths, there lived rulers whose lives were far more disturbing than the history usually admits. Not because they were evil, but because they were never given a choice. Tonight, we're exploring the disturbing life of the pharaohs, not the legends, the people, the children raised as gods, the rulers trapped by divine expectation, the humans slowly erased by power, our ritual, and fear. Before we begin, I want to know something. If you're watching this, type in the comments where you're watching from. A country, a city, anywhere in the world. I read them all. And if you're drawn to the darker side of history, the stories that don't make it into textbooks, consider subscribing. This channel isn't about glorifying power. It's about understanding what it does to the people who hold it. Because the pharaoh was not just a king. He was worshipped as a god, blamed for floods, punished for famine, and judged even after death. He was expected to be perfect forever. So take a breath, dim the lights, and remember this as we begin. The most terrifying thing about ancient Egypt wasn't the curses. It was what it did to the humans it called divine. Before we talk about pyramids, before the gold, the power, the legends, we need to talk about the child. Because every pharaoh, no matter how feared, worshipped, or monstrous, began life as a boy or girl trapped inside a role they did not choose. In ancient Egypt, the moment a royal child was born, their humanity quietly began to disappear. They weren't welcomed into the world as a baby. They were announced as a god in flesh. Imagine this. You are born, and before you can speak, before you can walk, before you can even understand fear, everyone around you is already afraid of you. Your nurses bow, your tutors kneel, your servants refuse to meet your eyes. You are never hugged without ceremony, never scolded like a normal child, never allowed to cry freely, because gods do not cry. From birth, the future pharaoh was taught one brutal truth. You are not human. And if you ever act like one, Egypt will fall. This wasn't poetry. This was law. A life without choice. The pharaoh did not choose their destiny. They didn't choose their name. They didn't choose their education. They didn't choose their spouse. Even their death was scheduled in advance. Royal children were isolated early, raised inside palace walls, thick with incense, silence, and fear. They were watched constantly, not to protect them, but to ensure they behaved like gods. Any weakness, fear, compassion, doubt, was not seen as innocence. It was seen as danger. The first trauma. The most disturbing part. Royal children were often separated from their biological mothers. Why? Because love creates attachment, and attachment creates weakness. Instead, they were raised by nurses and priests, people whose loyalty was not to the child, but to the throne. Imagine growing up never knowing if the smile you receive is real or politically necessary. Trained to rule or die. Education for a future pharaoh was merciless. From childhood, they were taught sacred texts, state propaganda, military tactics, religious rituals, how to kill, how to command executions, but never how to grieve, how to love, how to doubt. Because a pharaoh who questions himself is a pharaoh who collapses. They were trained to sit perfectly still for hours. Why? Because one day they would sit on the throne while thousands watched, waiting for a single twitch to interpret the will of the gods, the lie they were forced to believe. Here's the psychological trap. The Pharaoh was told, "You are Horus on earth. Your blood is divine. Your body is sacred." But at the same time, they were constantly guarded. Poison tasters, bodyguards, secret tunnels. If you are a god, why does everyone expect you to be assassinated? This contradiction eats at the mind. And it did. Many pharaohs grew paranoid early, convinced betrayal was everywhere, and sometimes they were right. Brothers as enemies. In royal households, siblings were not friends. They were threats. Every brother was a potential rival. Every sister was a political asset. Children learned young survival mattered more than affection. Some pharaohs would later erase their siblings from history entirely, chiseling names off walls, smashing statues, rewriting memory itself. In ancient Egypt, to be forgotten was worse than death. The cursed crown. By adolescence, the future pharaoh understood something terrifying. There was no escape. If they ruled poorly, they would be blamed for famine, plague, war. If the Nile flooded too much, or not enough, it wasn't nature's fault. It was the pharaoh's sin. Imagine being told that the universe itself depends on your moral perfection. No therapist, no confession, no forgiveness, only ritual. The moment before power. Most people imagine coronation as triumph, but for many pharaohs, it was the moment they realized, "I will never be alone again, and I will never be myself." The crown was not freedom. It was a cage, forged from gold, blood, and divine expectation. And this is only the beginning, because once crowned, the pharaoh was expected to do things that would shatter the mind of any normal human being, including acts of ritual, killing incest, justified as divine purity, and preparing for death while still alive. Pause. Now we will descend deeper. Why pharaohs married their own sisters. How religion justified cruelty. The first sanctioned murders they were forced to order, and how absolute power slowly, quietly destroyed them from within. The gods were watching, and the price of failure was eternal chaos. By the time a pharaoh sat on the throne, they already knew something the rest of Egypt never fully understood. Being a god was lonely, terrifyingly lonely, because gods were not allowed to love like humans. The most shocking rule. Let's talk about something deeply unsettling, something historians still struggle to explain without discomfort. Pharaohs were expected to marry their own sisters, sometimes half-sisters, sometimes full sisters, sometimes their own daughters. Not in secret, not in shame, but in ceremony. To us, this is horrifying. To ancient Egypt, it was sacred. Why incest was divine. The royal bloodline was believed to be pure, not metaphorically, literally. The gods married their own siblings, Osiris and Isis, Set and Nephthys. So if a pharaoh was truly divine, who else was worthy of them? Certainly not a commoner, not even a noble, only someone with the same blood, the same curse. But imagine this, from the inside. You grow up with someone as your sister. You share tutors, meals, childhood fears, and then one day, she is no longer your sister. She's your wife, and everyone around you pretends this is not disturbing. The silence around the bedchamber. There are no diaries describing how these marriages felt. No love letters, no confessions, only statues, stone faces, perfect posture. But bodies tell stories, and royal mummies tell a brutal one. Many pharaohs were physically deformed, misshapen skulls, cleft palates, club feet, weak immune systems, chronic pain. These were not accidents. They were consequences, the price of keeping blood divine. Some pharaohs could barely walk. Others suffered constant illness. And yet, they were paraded as living gods, smiling, painted, untouchable. When the body betrays the god. Imagine waking up every day in pain. Your bones hurt, your body fails you, but you cannot show weakness, because weakness means the gods have turned against Egypt. So you smile, you perform rituals, you sacrifice animals, and slowly you begin to hate the body you were born into. This is where something dark begins to happen. Power stops feeling like responsibility and starts feeling like compensation. Love becomes control. Many pharaohs did not love their spouses. They owned them. Royal wives were not partners. They were symbols. Their value was measured in heirs. If they failed to produce a healthy son, they were replaced or erased. Some were forced into religious exile, becoming priestesses, a polite way of saying they were removed quietly. And when jealousy entered the palace, it turned lethal. Poison in gold cups. The royal court was obsessed with assassination because it happened a lot. Poison was everywhere, in wine, in cosmetics, on rings, on ceremonial daggers. Pharaohs employed full-time poison tasters, men and women whose sole job was to die first. Let that sink in. Your safety depended on watching someone collapse in front of you. Over time, this changes a person. Empathy erodes. Life becomes expendable. The first order to kill. Every pharaoh had a moment. The first execution they authorized. Sometimes it was a traitor, sometimes a priest, sometimes a sibling, sometimes a child born with the wrong bloodline. And once that order was given, there was no return. The pharaoh learned something crucial. I decide who exists. And that realization, it rewires the human mind. The mask never comes off. Publicly, pharaohs were serene, calm, balanced, eternal. Privately, many were paranoid, insomniac, violently suspicious. Some surrounded themselves with guards, even while sleeping. Others slept in different chambers every night. A few trusted no one at all, because when you are worshipped as a god, you never know if someone loves you or wants your throne. The tragedy of absolute power. Here's the most disturbing truth. Pharaohs were not evil by nature. They were manufactured, broken by expectations placed on them before they could speak, denied normal love, denied equality, denied failure. So they learned dominance instead, cruelty instead, control instead. And the longer they ruled, the less human they became. Pause. Let it breathe. Next, we will go even deeper into darkness, ritual killing, and human sacrifice. Why pharaohs obsessed over death while still alive. The terrifying process of mummification, planned years in advance. And how some pharaohs began to fear the gods they claimed to be. Because in ancient Egypt, being a god did not mean you were free. It meant you were trapped between life and death long before you ever died. The ancient Egyptians believed something terrifying. They believed death was not an end. It was a test, and pharaohs were expected to pass it perfectly. Obsession with the afterlife. For most Egyptians, the afterlife was a hope. For the pharaoh, it was an obligation. Because if the pharaoh failed in death, the entire cosmic order, Ma'at, would collapse. The Nile would dry. The sun would not rise. Chaos would swallow the world. That is what they were taught from childhood. So pharaohs did something no modern ruler has ever done. They prepared for death while still alive, constantly, obsessively, designing your own corpse. Some pharaohs began planning their tombs before they ever ruled. They supervised the carving of burial chambers, the writing of funerary spells, the placement of organs, the layout of their own body. They chose which gods would guard their soul. They chose which servants would follow them into eternity. And sometimes they chose who would die with them. Human sacrifice, the uncomfortable truth. Officially, Egypt claimed to reject human sacrifice, but archaeology tells a quieter, darker story. Early dynastic tombs contain mass graves, servants, guards, officials, all buried at the same time as the pharaoh. These people were not honored. They were used, believed to be needed in the afterlife. Imagine knowing that serving the pharaoh faithfully might mean dying the moment he does. And imagine being the pharaoh, knowing others will be killed, to accompany you beyond death. What does that do to a conscience? The ritual of daily godhood. Every day, the pharaoh reenacted divine rituals. They were dressed like gods, fed like gods, addressed like gods. But here's the contradiction. At night, they were alone with the knowledge that gods do not decay, humans do. The fear of rot. Pharaohs were deeply afraid of decomposition. Because if the body decayed, the soul would not recognize it. And if the soul failed to return to the body, eternal annihilation awaited. Not hell, not punishment, oblivion. This fear drove them to extremes. They demanded perfect preservation, perfect rituals, perfect obedience, because any mistake meant the pharaoh would cease to exist forever. The horror of mummification. Let's talk about the process, because it is not peaceful. It is violent. The brain was pulled out through the nose, slowly liquefied and scraped away, internal organs removed, the body dehydrated for 40 days, stuffed, reshaped, wrapped tightly. The goal was not beauty, it was recognizability, so the soul could find its way home. Pharaohs watched this process performed on others. Over and over, they knew exactly what awaited them. They rehearsed it. Some even attended mock funerals, alive, watching priests practice on effigies of their own bodies. The moment doubt set in. Not all pharaohs believed. Some feared, quietly, because what if the rituals were wrong? What if the gods rejected them? What if they were never gods at all? There are records of pharaohs building multiple tombs, just in case. Hidden chambers, false corridors, decoys, a sign of faith or terror. The god who feared judgment. In the afterlife, the pharaoh's heart would be weighed against a feather, the feather of truth. If the heart was heavier, it would be eaten, destroyed, gone. No eternity, no legacy, no worship. So ask yourself this. How does a man who has ordered executions, lived in excess, and ruled through fear, sleep at night knowing his heart will be judged? Some pharaohs became obsessed with justification, building temples, donating wealth, erasing crimes from history, Because if it wasn't recorded, did it really happen? Erasing the self. This leads to something chilling. Pharaohs didn't just rewrite history. They rewrote themselves. Statues were altered, names changed, deeds exaggerated, failures removed. They tried to sculpt a soul worthy of eternity, even if it wasn't true. Pause. Let silence stretch. In the next part, the illusion begins to crack completely. When pharaohs lost control. Madness, cruelty, and divine delusion. The pharaohs who were hated and knew it. And the moment Egypt realized, gods could bleed. Because absolute power does not just corrupt, it isolates. And isolation breeds monsters. For centuries, Egypt survived on a single illusion, that the pharaoh was untouchable, that he was eternal, that he was more than flesh. And then, the illusion broke. The first cracks in divinity. It didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly. A failed harvest, a flood that came too late, a disease priests could not explain. For the first time, people whispered something unthinkable. What if the pharaoh is wrong? Not evil, not weak, just wrong. And for a god king, being wrong was worse than being cruel. When the Nile stopped listening. The Nile was sacred. Its flooding was proof that the pharaoh was favored by the gods. But there were years when the river betrayed Egypt. Fields cracked open, children starved, animals collapsed in the heat. And suddenly, the pharaoh's perfection was questioned. Priests scrambled for explanations, rituals intensified, sacrifices increased. But hunger has a way of stripping belief down to bone. The pharaoh heard the whispers. They were careful, quiet, but the pharaoh heard them. He always did, because paranoia had already taken root. Guards multiplied, executions increased. Anyone who spoke too freely was accused of disturbing Mahat. Order, truth, balance. A word so powerful it justified everything. Cruelty as a defense mechanism. When fear rises, power hardens. Some pharaohs responded with mercy. Most responded with violence, not because they enjoyed it, but because fear demanded certainty, and cruelty creates obedience, at least temporarily. Entire villages were punished for imagined offenses. Priests disappeared overnight. Records were rewritten, statues smashed. The pharaoh was no longer protecting order. He was defending his identity. The god who couldn't trust his own reflection. Here's the most disturbing part. Pharaohs were surrounded by mirrors, polished bronze, gold, obsidian, and yet many stopped looking at themselves because mirrors showed age, wrinkles, illness, decay, things gods were not supposed to have. Some pharaohs ordered artists to carve them eternally young, even as their bodies failed, even as their hands trembled, even as their minds slipped. Madness in the palace. Power without contradiction breeds delusion, and some pharaohs crossed that line. They began to believe. Their thoughts were divine commands, their anger, holy judgment, their paranoia, prophecy. They punished people for crimes that had not yet happened, because they believed the gods had revealed it. No one could challenge them, because to question the pharaoh was to question the universe itself. When gods were killed, yes, pharaohs were assassinated, strangled in their sleep, poisoned by family, stabbed by guards they trusted. And when it happened, something irreversible occurred. The people saw it. Gods did not die quietly. Gods did not bleed. Gods did not beg, but pharaohs did. The aftermath of a dead god. After a pharaoh's death, chaos followed. Because if a god could be murdered, then what else was a lie? Priests rushed to control the narrative. The death was framed as divine transition. Never weakness, never betrayal, never fear. But the damage was done. Belief had cracked. The loneliest moment. Imagine the final days of a pharaoh, older, sicker, surrounded by servants who fear him, priests who flatter him, guards who might kill him, and no one who sees him as a man. In those final nights, many pharaohs were terrified, not of death, but of judgment, of being weighed, of being found heavy. Long pause. In part 5, we reached the final descent. The pharaohs who were erased from history. The deliberate destruction of memory. The final irony of immortality. And why, in the end, no pharaoh truly escaped being human. Because eternity was promised, but humanity was never forgiven. When a pharaoh died, Egypt did not mourn a man, it mourned an idea. Because the moment the body stopped breathing, the lie had to survive. Death was not the end of control. A pharaoh's power did not end at death. In many ways, it intensified. Priests moved quickly. The narrative had to be sealed. Statues commissioned. Titles expanded. Failures omitted. Because the afterlife depended on memory. And memory was political. The worst fate imaginable. To ancient Egyptians, there was something worse than death. Erasure. To have your name removed, your image destroyed, your existence denied. Because if your name was not spoken, your soul would wander forever, hungry, lost, unremembered. Some pharaohs feared this more than judgment, more than annihilation. Because erasure meant you never mattered. The pharaohs who were unmade. When a pharaoh fell from favor, when he was hated, blamed, or seen as illegitimate, history turned on him. Names chiseled off temple walls, faces smashed from reliefs, statues buried or shattered, official records rewritten. Not to punish the man, but to kill him twice, once in body, once in eternity. And this was done deliberately, calmly, methodically, by priests who once bowed before him. Immortality, with conditions. Pharaohs were promised immortality, but it came with rules. Behave correctly, honor the gods, maintain order, win wars, prevent famine, never show weakness, fail, and eternity would be revoked. So ask yourself, was that immortality or a hostage situation? The final irony. Thousands of years later, we remember the pharaohs, but not as gods. We remember them as mummies, as skeletons, as damaged bodies, as DNA samples, as case studies of power gone wrong. The pyramids still stand, but the men inside them, silent, stripped of divinity, reduced to bone. What they never got to be. Here's the tragedy history rarely acknowledges. Pharaohs were never allowed to be ordinary, loved without fear, wrong without consequence, human without punishment. They were worshipped by millions and understood by no one. Absolute power did not make them free. It trapped them in ritual, in expectation, in isolation. The last night. Imagine the final night. An old pharaoh lies awake. The palace is quiet. Incense burns low. Guards stand outside the door. He knows what comes next. The weighing of the heart, the feather, the judgment. And for the first time, he is not a god, just a man, alone. The truth ancient Egypt never said out loud. The most disturbing truth of all: pharaohs were not monsters. They were children raised without mercy, given power before identity, divinity before choice, control before love, and expected to remain perfect forever. The legacy. Ancient Egypt teaches us something uncomfortable, not about gods, but about power. When a society demands perfection from its rulers, it creates tyranny. When it worships leaders as more than human, it destroys them. And when it denies leaders the right to be human, they will eventually remind you, violently. Long pause. Let silence speak. Closing line. Let it land slowly. The pharaohs ruled the living. They obsessed over the dead. And in the end, they never truly lived at all. And that is the disturbing truth of the pharaohs. Not gods, not monsters, but humans placed under a weight no human mind was ever meant to carry. They ruled the world's greatest civilization. They built monuments that defied time. They were worshipped, feared, obeyed. And yet, they lived lives of isolation, paranoia, and quiet terror, surrounded by millions and understood by no one. Pause. If there's one thing ancient Egypt teaches us, it's this. When power is treated as divine, humanity becomes expendable, and history always collects the debt. Before you leave, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how far these ancient stories still travel, and if this kind of storytelling resonates with you. Slow, unsettling, human-focused history. Consider subscribing to the channel. Not for algorithms, not for trends, but because there are countless stories like this, buried beneath myths, monuments, and silence. Final pause, then softly. Thank you for listening. Sleep well. And remember, even gods were only human in the dark.